Up until a few months ago, 4K PC gaming on OLED panels was something of a niche thing. If you were set on getting the instant response times and true blacks of OLED on PC, your best bet was somehow fitting a 42-inch TV on your desk or mounting it on a wall behind it. Professional grade OLED monitors were also an option, but these were limited to 60Hz and came with hefty price tags of $3,000 or more. This all started to change about 2 years ago with the introduction of 240Hz 1440p gaming OLED panels, and while OLED was finally attainable, those early panels had issues with text clarity due to their unusual subpixel layouts. For me, this would have been a massive downgrade from the 4K panel in my LG 32GS95UE, so I decided to wait some more for the inevitable holy grail, a 4K OLED panel with a refresh rate of at least 120Hz. Now, with this new crop of 4K OLED panels, a somewhat no-compromise upgrade is finally here. 32-inch 4K OLED at a refresh rate of 240Hz. With several manufacturers competing on price, integrating panels manufactured by either Samsung or LG. The one I have in front of me today is the LG 32GS95, which uses LG's qd-oled technology. So after a little over 2 months with the panel, I'm ready to share my impressions, findings, and general thoughts on using a 4K OLED as my daily driver. The choice of going for the LG was somewhat subjective, sprinkled with some yet to be confirmed hypothesis. The subjective part has to do with the design of the panel and its excellent build quality. I love the super clean front with its symmetrical bezel going all around with no branding or visible logos. It's by far the best looking monitor from the crop of recently released 32-inch 4K OLED panels, and I really appreciate that LG decided to go for a more understated design with this one. In terms of objective reasoning, there's the fact that qd-oled panels perform better in brighter rooms, maintaining those famous OLED true blacks, while Samsung's qd-oled technology suffers from a purplish tint in dark areas when direct light hits the panel, such as light from a side window like the one I have next to my desk. qd-oled panels also have lower power consumption and in theory should have better longevity. In addition to that, the unit is actively cooled and somewhat conservatively tuned by LG. On the flip side, panels of the qd-oled variety have greater color volume and are available with glossy coatings. Despite being superior in almost every way to LCDs, both of these OLED technologies suffer from burn-in. Each pixel has a limited lifespan, slowly getting dimmer over time. When displaying static images, this process is accelerated due to uneven wear. Counteractive measures can only do so much before uniformity is permanently affected. So one of my aims with this video and follow-up content will be to test the panel for burn-in at regular intervals. Tim from Monitors Unboxed has already published a video showing burn-in on a 32-inch 4K qd-oled monitor after only 3 months of use, so it will be interesting to see if qd-oled proves to be any more resilient. Right, so why am I willing to risk panel degradation by using OLED? OLED simply gets you the best possible image and motion clarity for gaming. For work and video editing, however, my old 4K IPS panel would be better suited. Black levels and instant response times are irrelevant for that use case, and if anything, the lower contrast of IPS panels is easier on the eyes when doing productivity work. But switching between two panels depending on use case is not something I want to put up with. So in the name of science, I decided to use OLED full time. But at least I'll be able to document the process, and in the worst case, you guys can learn from my mistakes. Or I'll get to prove that OLED is usable for desktop use in the best case. Going back to my first impressions, straight away one of the most noticeable things was the size of the panel. For me, 32-inch is getting a bit into hard to manage territory. So much so that I barely managed to fit the tiny Form T1 build in between the monitor and my LS50 speakers. And this on a 160 centimeters wide desk. The monitor does come with an excellent stand that's super easy to adjust, but I prefer using a monitor arm as it just makes the setup look a lot cleaner. You do get used to the size, and the increased immersion in games is no doubt worth it. It feels somewhat closer to using a 34-inch ultra-wide panel. I wanted to say I preferred the pixel density and the more manageable size of my previous 27-inch panel, but after putting it back on the monitor arm, I was surprised at how small it felt after 2 months of using the 32-inch OLED. Funny how that goes. As for the picture quality itself, the first thing that stood out to me was the poor text clarity. The lower pixel density due to the larger size, in combination with the non-standard subpixel layout, makes text a bit less nice to look at than what I'm used to from a 4K panel. This too is something you get used to, but it is noticeable, there's no debate here. Windows expects a monitor with a standard RGB subpixel layout, and anything that strays away from that will result in text that is either somewhat soft on qd-oled panels or exhibits color fringing on qd-oled panels. For gaming, this is somewhat irrelevant, but open any text-heavy productivity app and you'll notice it, especially when looking at smaller fonts. There's a huge debate out there about glossy versus matte displays. I won't open that can of worms other than to say that if you look for the graininess of the matte coating on this display, you will notice it. But it is what it is. For me, it wouldn't make or break getting the display, but I think I too would prefer a glossy screen if given the choice. Perhaps what I was looking forward to the most was trying out HDR. Actual HDR, not just the sad approximation on my previous panel. OLED panels do not have a backlight. As such, each individual pixel can get as bright or as dark as needed to create scenes ranging from pitch dark to nearly blinding highlights. HDR implementations aren't all created equal, and some games do it better than others. Titles like Ghost of Tsushima and Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart do it exceptionally well. I played the entirety of Ghost of Tsushima in HDR and it was one of my favorite gaming experiences to date. With the right settings and some tweaking, the panel gets more than bright enough to make for an immersive HDR experience, but it won't be effective in bright conditions. To get the most out of it, it really helps if you play in a darker environment or even in complete darkness for maximum effect. A night scene in Ghost of Tsushima with moonlight reflected in mud and puddles really is something to behold, and not few were the times where I would just mess around looking at bright sources of light. Early reviews of this panel did point out its somewhat inaccurate EOTF tracking in HDR, which resulted in crushed blacks. Fortunately, this has been addressed by a firmware fix, and I have links in the description to some up-to-date brightness measurements and detailed testing. With that in mind, I'll put the settings I ended up using on screen. The monitor retains settings between modes, so you don't have to constantly adjust things back and forth. Personally, I use the Windows Alt-B shortcut to toggle between HDR and SDR as needed. For HDR, the only certified mode is the Gamer 1 profile. Sadly, this mode has inaccurate EOTF tracking when peak brightness is set to high as per ratings review of this panel, which means that the panel isn't getting as bright as it theoretically could. For some reason, however, the Gamer 2 profile has accurate peak brightness high setting, and this makes it the more desirable mode. This may change in the future with firmware updates, but for the time being, I've adjusted the Gamer 2 settings so that they match the ones found under the Gamer 1 profile, but with peak brightness set to high, of course. Using Gamer 1 with peak brightness set to low is by no means a poor HDR experience, but Gamer 2 with peak brightness set to high and the adjusted settings makes for a more impactful HDR experience, at least in the titles I've tried so far. For SDR, I use the Gamer 1 preset with most settings on default and peak brightness set to off to preserve color accuracy. In terms of burn-in precautions, I don't do anything out of the ordinary, but I have decided to enable the auto-hide behavior of the Windows taskbar. Additionally, I have an aggressive screensaver that displays a full black image, meaning that the pixels are effectively turned off. If I step away from my desk for longer than, say, 10 minutes or so, then I manually turn off the display. I use dark themes when available, but if I have to work in apps that are predominantly light, I do so and I don't really obsess over it. Brightness in HDR is always set to 100%, and in SDR I set it to about 80% during the day, which is roughly 200 nits. So what about that 240Hz refresh rate? Honestly, it feels like I'm spoiled with a 50% higher refresh rate than my previous monitor. There's more refresh rate than I have frame rate to throw at it, and that's on an RTX 4090. Even crazier than that, this panel has a 1080p mode that can push an eye-watering 480Hz refresh rate. Motion in this mode is crystal clear, but there's only a handful of games that can run at such insane refresh rates, and pretty much all of them are competitive games, of which I don't really play any. Doom Eternal is the only non-competitive, relatively recent title that can run at those kinds of frame rates, and that's on a 4090 no less. Personally, I wouldn't trade resolution for refresh rate in a single-player title. In most recent games, even on a 4090, you're not going to get even close to capping out the 240Hz refresh rate available in the native 4K resolution, even with DLSS and frame generation. Add ray tracing to that, and you're lucky to be breaking 100 frames per second. But it doesn't really matter, OLED has perfect pixel response time at any refresh rate. It's as good as it gets no matter what frame rate you're playing at. It's not all roses and sunshine though. VRR flicker is somewhat of a thing with OLEDs. Fluctuations in frame rate result in subtle gamma shifts that look like the panel is flickering. To me, this isn't really that big of a deal, as I always use frame rate caps to keep frame rates as stable as possible. But it is pretty much unavoidable, even with a perfect frame rate, and it's most noticeable in darker scenes. I mentioned earlier that qd-oled panels have reduced color volume compared to qd-oled variants, but that's only half the story. In HDR, the peak brightness algorithm is only boosting the white subpixel, which can result in a muted looking picture when scenes get bright. I recommend reading this excellent review by Dylan Raga, where he explains this behavior in detail much better than I could. For a long time now, I've been using an app called Vibrance GUI to boost color vibrance on a game-by-game basis, and I find it works great in HDR as well to give games that extra bit of color punch, even though this is an imperfect solution that doesn't really address the core issue of why this monitor can look a bit muted in HDR. This of course is a non-issue when using the monitor in SDR. In fact, there are titles I prefer playing in this mode, like Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, which I played entirely in SDR. HDR implementations can differ and not all are created equal. What I'm trying to say is that SDR on an OLED is nothing to scoff at and a huge leap over SDR on a traditional LCD display. So are there any other caveats with this monitor? Yes, there's actually one more. I can hear the damn fan. When my PC is idle, it's by far the loudest fan on my desk. Take a listen. Unfortunately, there's no way to turn the thing off. Well, there kind of is. You can go into the service menu and reduce its speed, and it more or less becomes inaudible. But every time you turn off the display, you have to do this all over again. Not ideal. It may or may not be a common thing on this particular model, but in any case, I'm not going to return it just for this. Plus, I still need to conduct my long-term burn-in test. And while we're at it, here's my burn-in timeline. There's only 2 measurement points so far, and hopefully you can see through YouTube's compression that there's no burn-in yet. If not, you'll have to take my word for it, or check the source files linked in the description below. Brightness levels seem to be a tiny bit lower, but this could just be normal variance. We'll see further down the line if there's any trend developing here. As for whether or not I recommend getting a 4K OLED, I don't think there's an easy answer, as burn-in remains the biggest concern. Cost is another one, but not too long ago we were paying similar prices for 4K LCD screens with 144Hz refresh rates, and with that in mind, these current OLED panels are for many a dream come true. If you're in the market for a gaming-only monitor, I wouldn't even think twice about going for OLED. Get whichever you can get your hands on and is cheapest in your region, probably one of the qd-oled models from MSI or Gigabyte. For a mixed use of productivity and gaming, it gets tougher. OLED offers no benefit for productivity. If anything, it's a hindrance. Every hour spent looking at spreadsheets is an hour of accumulating pixel degradation with zero benefit. The panel may or may not maintain its uniformity for several years, but it's too early to tell, and it's a near certainty that it will not outlive an LCD panel. That's about it for this one. I hope you guys found the video interesting, even though it's a departure from my usual content. Let me know down in the comments if there's anything I missed or if there's questions I've left unanswered. Bye for now.